Let's take a look at how bryophytes vary from one another. Well, particularly mosses, but let's take a look at all the bryophytes one more time. Bryophytes, you will recall, are non-vascular plants. Gametophyte is the dominant generation. The sporophyte is permanently attached to the gametophyte. There are 3 phyla of bryophytes, one of which is the Bryophyta in a narrow sense, mosses. They're the most important and the most species in Ohio. And they're the ones that we'll be focusing on for that reason, and also because, well, you can't do everything. But there are 2 other bryophyte phyla, the Hornworts and the Liverworts. Hornworts. Hornworts have a gametophyte that looks kind of like a liverwort, some liverworts, in that it's undifferentiated, kind of flat, sort of dorsiventral, not very leafy, not leafy at all. And the sporophyte is actually shaped like a horn. The gametophytes at the bottom in this picture, I'm drawing a crude circle around it, and the sporophytes are these horns. They grow, by the way, in an unusual way by adding cells at their base, not their tip. Basal meristems, they're kind of unusual in plants. In Ohio, we only have 2 or 3 species of hornworts, and 2 of them, or one of them, depending upon some taxonomic details that I don't think have been worked out too well, have sporophytes that look like a horn. This one, on the other hand, has sporophytes. They're laying flat. Here's a diagram that shows where the sporophytes are. I'll go back. Boom. Liverworts. About a third as many liverworts in Ohio as there are mosses. They're not as frequently studied. They tend to be sort of small and mixed in with mosses, tend to get pretty brittle when they're dry, so they're a little hard to study. There aren't as many books for them, but they're great. They're great. In liverworts, liverworts seem to have taken the gametophyte and made them more elaborate in a lot of cases, but the sporophytes are comparatively simple. Most liverworts don't fit into the pattern of what you'd think a liverwort would be like, i.e., namely, like a liver. The ones that are like a liver, meaning sort of undifferentiated and lobed, are called thallose liverworts. So in this diagram with 4 pictures, the upper left one is a thallose liverwort. The other 3 are leafy liverworts, which most liverworts are. Here's a picture of that thallose liverwort, really famous one. It's called Mercantia. It's the only well-known thallose liverwort because it's the one that shows up in biology texts, and that's principally because it shows up in greenhouses and flower pots, and biology instructors can usually get their hands on them. They produce their sporophytes on these elevated stalks. There's some here that look like an umbrella, and there's some here that look kind of like jellyfish. And those aren't actually sporophytes, but the sporophytes are produced on the undersurface of the ones that look like jellyfish. So these are called archegoniophores. Eggs are produced underneath these lobes and eventually sporophytes. The ones that are just more round discs, those are the male ones that produce sperm. And, oh, by the way, Mercantia also reproduces asexually. It produces these what look like little bird's nests. They're gemmicups. And those little discs that would be the eggs, if those were bird's nests, are things that can grow into new liverworts if they get splashed out of those cups. So that's a thallose liverwort. This is another thallose liverwort. Really common one on sandstone and even sometimes limestone, calcareous surfaces. It has a very snakeskin-like appearance and a really interesting aroma, citrus kind of smell when you crush it. Alas, in better times we go on a field trip to Hocking Hills and we get to see this conocephalum close up and even a little scratch and sniff. This is another thallose liverwort. It's one called Robulia hemispherica. And again, most of what we see in the bottom here is the gametophyte. And this, you'd think it's a sporophyte, but actually the sporophytes are dangling off these lobes here. So it's a structure that produces the eggs, and when they get fertilized, the sporophytes develop there. And in this species, the male, the antheridia, are on these little pads at the base of the at the base of the thallus, or on the thallus surface. And that's a thallus liverwort. But most liverworts are leafy. How to tell them from mosses? Well, many of them are flatter. They have 2 ranks of leaves, whereas moss leaves are generally inserted spirally. The liverworts actually have 3 ranks of leaves, but there are 2 on the sides, and there's one smaller one on the bottom, so the underleaves. And this one is called Byzania trilobita. It's fairly common in kind of mounds in hemlock woods, and also growing on boulders. Here's 2 leafy liverworts growing together. The one on the left, which is larger, with the bidentate leaves. That's another thing that differentiates liverworts from mosses, is that their leaves can be lobed, which moss leaves never are, or almost never, and in our area never are. And sometimes they're intricately folded, or really just kind of very elaborate. Like the little one on the right, the leaves look like little billowed sails. 2 species of liverworts growing on decorticated wood logs. This is one called Frilly Nia. This is very, very, very common. It looks like targets, spider webs growing on the bark of trees, and it's extremely common. It has the lower lobe shaped like a pitcher, and this picture of this picture actually has a little animal in it called a rotifer that's living inside the lobule of this Frilly Nia. Kind of a cool thing. But the more important bryophytes are the mosses. A little over 400 species in Ohio, and here's a few pictured here. Let's take a look at some of the things that we can use to differentiate mosses and tell and maybe identify them. So here's a picture of some mosses. It happens to be called haircap moss in the genus Polytrichum. It's kind of a big one, and what you see mostly here is gametophyte. Over on the left-hand side of the picture, there are some sporophytes. This is another moss, which is in a different group. It's called Sphagnum, or peat moss. Peat mosses are notable for growing in nutrient-poor conditions, and they absorb a lot of water because they have some special cells that are hollow and dead and empty, and they have holes in them, and they fill with water. And that's what sphagnum moss is. So if you're interested in mosses, there are some books. Here's a field guide, Common Mosses of the Northeast. Here's a technical manual called Mosses of the Great Lakes Forest by Howard Crum. It's written for Michigan, but it works pretty well for Ohio. Here's a set of books for over $400, kind of expensive, but kind of expensive. And the Flora of North America covers all of North America, unlike this rather expensive book, which is Eastern North America, which is actually better if it's restricted, because then you don't get confused looking at species that aren't in Ohio, say. And Maine mosses. Maine is not very close to Ohio, but a lot of the species are the same, and it's a good book. 2 books, actually. So, let's take a look at some of the features that vary among mosses, and mostly they have to do with leaves. It's not a whole lot different from how you'd identify trees and shrubs. So we're interested in whether or not we're interested in something to do with the growth form of the mosses, which I'll mention briefly in a moment, and the shapes of leaves. But here, look how these leaves on this rhizonium, they're especially broad, and they have this mid-vein called a costa. Here are some whose leaves are especially narrow. So there are a lot of distinctions that you can make, even with just a hand lens. This is one of the features of mosses that's helpful for identification that you can actually see with the hand lens. It's called a costa. You would want to call it the mid-vein of the leaf, but since they're not vascular plants, it's not a vein. Sometimes it's just called a nerve, if you don't want to use a term that's wholly unfamiliar, but costa. And that's sort of a thickened area. It makes the leaves be able to stand out and have some more rigidity than they would otherwise have. Some mosses have them, some don't. So it's a very good identification feature. Here's an example where the costa sticks out like a little awn, like a little claw. If you can see that, that will help you identify some mosses. Here's some microscopic features, which are a little bit challenging to see. Well, here's a moss that has no apparent costa. Unless you look at it really close, you see it's actually short and V-shaped. And the margins of the leaves, they might be toothed. See, this is not a whole lot different than trees. The margins of the leaf can be toothed. So here's a species of moss where the margin of the leaf is entire. It's not toothed. Here's a species of moss where the margin of the leaf is toothed, and each tooth is single. I mean, how else could it be? Well, there's a few mosses whose leaves are kind of like making a little V for victory sign. They're double-toothed. So serration is distinctive, and you might be able to see that with a hand lens. Things you unfortunately can't see with the hand lens, which is why microscopes are good, are the cells, the shapes of the cells. So here's some cells that are long and narrow on the left here. Here are some cells that are diamond-shaped over here on the right. Okay, here's a very good characteristic that would be excellent for identifying mosses, but you totally need a microscope. But if you do, you're in luck. Some moss cells are pointy. They have bumps. The bumps can either be in the middle of the cell, or they can be at the ends of the cells, like in this Bryophytes graminicular, or they can have lots of little bumps. So that's called being papillose. And having these papillae is a very good feature for identifying mosses, absence or presence. Whoa, this moss has insane papillae. They branched a few times, and that would be a fairly easy one to identify, the genus anyway. So here's an example of a moss whose leaves have stout single papillae. Mosses that have papillae are sometimes have a sort of a matte look to them. They're not super shiny because of the papillae, and then sometimes a lighter color. So even though it's a microscopic feature, sometimes you can deduce it by looking at them from a distance. Not always. Here's another feature that unfortunately is very useful for identification but requires a microscope. And these are what are called alar cells. The cells at the lower corners of the leaf sometimes are differentiated. They're larger. Sometimes they're puffed up like little balloons. And I believe this helps the leaves fold out when the moisture changes, in order to fan out and become active when there's enough water. Alar cells. So if they're differentiated, it helps you, or not. Either way, it helps you tell what kind of moss it is. Here's one who has this pale margin. That's kind of different. Here's one who has pale leaves, pale cells at the base of the leaf, and then it extends up the margin, kind of like a little V-shaped. That's a very good characteristic of this genus called Tortella. And the leaves are very, very densely, many papillose. Good thing to use a microscope for. Sporophytes. Naturally, they vary too. We've seen examples where the sporophytes don't have seta, stalks, so the sporangium just fits in the top of the plant and the leaves sort of surround it. There are some where the sporophytes are upright. There are some where the sporophytes are nodding. And all of those things can be used to identify mosses. This is a figure from an article a friend of mine wrote about classification of mosses based on the sporophyte. And the pictures are all taken by me. And he put together this nice little composite illustration showing some of the variability in sporophytes. Here's some more pictures showing variability in sporophytes. On the left, we see one called Barbula unguiculata. And on the right, we see one called Bryum argentium. And the difference in sporophytes is striking. Cylindric sporangium that's upright, and a more ovoid, almost pear-shaped sporangium that's strongly nodding. Here's one that has upright sporophytes and sporangia. This is one that's very noteworthy, having something to do with its calyptra. You recall from the previous unit that mosses have a covering on their sporophytes that's derived from the maternal gametophyte and is called a calyptra. And the calyptra in a moss called Polytrichum, which means many hairs, is composed of many hairs. It's a very hairy thing, and that is a nice diagnostic feature for mosses in this genus. Here's one that's called long-necked moss, and the sporangia have this long base that's thicker than usual for the base of a sporophyte or the top of a seta. It's called trematodon, long-necked moss. Here's one called Starr Moss. Here you can see long, narrow sporophytes and the long, narrow sporangia, and these ones have calyptra, which is not hairy. This is one called bark fork moss. So here we see some differences in the way that the sporophytes are shaped. Here's a little one with little pear-shaped sporophytes. Here's one with little sort of pencil-shaped sporophytes. Another feature that mosses have is the ability, in some cases, to reproduce asexually. So we've seen this brick wall in front of my house before. We've seen this picture before. And I pointed out in passing the Syntrichia that reproduces asexually. At the time, we were interested in the Antheridia and Archegonia of the Orthotrichum. But now let's take a closer look at the Syntrichia. Or not. There it is. Boom. Let's look at some other ways that mosses reproduce asexually. This is a moss called Olecumnium palustri, ribbed bog moss, and it produces what look like sporophytes. It's got a stalk, but if you look at the top, instead of there being a sporangium, there's these little clusters of what kind of look like leaves, but they're actually thicker. They're gemmy. Each one of those little units can fall down and make a new plant. This reproduces asexually. It also reproduces sexually. It's an interesting dichotomy. There have been studies of other mosses that have generally demonstrated that when mosses are not especially crowded, when they're on a site where there's a lot of area to colonize, they'll tend to reproduce asexually. A lot of investment in propagules that don't go very far, that's good if where they land is likely to be a good site to grow. But when it gets really crowded and there aren't a lot of sites nearby that it's likely that the mosses can establish with their gemmy, with their expensive few gemmy, they produce spores, which are much, much more numerous and can be dispersed very, very far to find entirely new places. So that might be the advantage of the two methods of reproduction. One's good for colonizing spots in the immediate vicinity when there are some, and the other is good for dispersing to faraway places. I knew it was here somewhere. This is Syntrichia papilosa close-up. And this is on the costa of the leaf are these little globular gemmy. Oh, by the way, this is also growing with another species in the same genus that has like leaf-like gemmy. Two species of Syntrichia growing amidst one another. This is one that's called Brother Liana, and it doesn't have the common name, the cheerleader moss, but it could, because this reminds me of cheerleaders with pom-poms, the little fluffy little ceremonial things, because what it does, it has very narrow leaves, but at the top of the stems are clusters of little stems that break off and make new plants, the little gemmiferous brood bodies. And this moss reproduces asexually. It grows on sandstone and also on decayed wood. Here's pictures through a microscope of two more mosses that reproduce asexually. And the one on the left is very, very common. Here's a sketch, a drawing of the one on the left. It's called Platygerrium repens. And it kind of reminded me of this character from The Simpsons. So I put him in there. It's called Platygerrium repens. So one more thing I'd like to mention that makes the study of botany interesting and might be particularly true for bryophytes is the degree to which they're dependent upon or have an affinity to particular substrates, the chemical conditions of where they're growing. Generally for bryophytes, because they're so small, and lichens also, because they're so small, rather than talk about the habitat they grow in, like marsh or woods or old field, generally we'll talk about more of a microenvironment, exactly where they are, the substrate, what it is they're growing on. And it's always fun to see things, showing up where you kind of expect them, or sometimes surprise, it's not where you expect it. So I just want to share with you one moss, which is a really nice one to see in southern Ohio. It's called the sword moss, Bryophytes norvegicum. And globally, it's not very common. It has a limited distribution, but we're in a really great spot to see it. And look where it grows, on moist, shaded sandstone. And so, where do we have moist, shaded sandstone? In the Hocking Hills. This is one of those grottos, those places where waterfalls dug away underneath, and it's perennially moist and not ever super cold. That's the place to see the beautiful sword moss, Bryophytes norvegicum. So, one more thing I want to mention before we begin to look at the ways to tell bryophytes apart. And that has to do with the growth forms of mosses. There are, kind of like with plants, woody plants, you might have shrubs and trees and vines. Mosses have two growth forms that usually you can categorize them as being in one or the other. And they're called, and what I'm showing here is actually couplets from a key that makes this distinction. And this is the difference here. Stems erect, simple, in other words, not branched, with this archegonia and the sporophytes terminal at the tip. These are called acro carps. Acro, like going up, like an acrobat, and carp, like a carpel, it means fruit. We totally know these aren't fruits, but just, familiar use of the term. That's how language works. Stems creeping, freely branched. And the archegonian sporophytes are like on the sides of the plant. These are called pleurocarps. I don't quite get the pleuro part, but that's what they are. These ones on the left, I sometimes like to call these cushion mosses, and the ones on the right I like to sometimes call carpet mosses. I'm not sure how universal those terms are, so maybe we should stick with acrocarp and pleurocarp. So what we're going to do, this is a picture of an acrocarp. This is a picture of a pleurocarp. What we're going to do is look at the ways in which we can categorize the mosses that we find in the field based upon those characteristics we saw and some things that are just self-explanatory. So we're going to have a bunch of acrocarps, and then categorize them by the shape of their leaves, really narrow leaves or really broad leaves or something in between. And that way we'll be able to subdivide mosses that we discover. Pleurocarps, same thing. Some of them have leaves shaped like little sickles. Some have leaves that are like needles. Some have leaves that are like swords. Some have leaves that are like tongues. Some have leaves without a costa. Some have leaves with a costa. And there's a few that I sometimes call the weird mosses because they're really different. There are some mosses that are strictly flat. Not very many, but when you see them, that's really distinctive. There are some mosses that are really distinctive because they have some ribbon-like tiers of cells on their leaves. Those are the haircat mosses. And the peat mosses, they're really weird. So we have three, the ones I circled here, the flat ones, the haircat mosses, and the peat mosses. They're kind of really unusual. And then acrocarps and pleurocarps subdivided by whether or not they have a costa and their leaf shape. And using these features, let's take a look in the next episode of Moss's Boss at some of the mosses that we might see in the field.